Story 4. The Agora's Murmurs. Commerce, Gossip, and the Rhythm of Athenian Markets. Section 1. The Marketplace Awakens. If you were to drift asleep in ancient Athens and awaken in the Agora, you would find yourself in a space that was neither temple nor palace, neither battlefield nor quiet home, but something far more ordinary and far more essential. The Agora was the beating heart of the city, where trade, gossip, politics, and philosophy all mingled in a steady hum of daily life. To walk its colonnaded edges, or to sit quietly on its dusty stones, was to see Athens not in moments of glory, but in the rhythms that sustained it. The Agora was not a single marketplace, but a sprawling open space, a gathering place at the center of the city. Around its edges stood stoas, covered colonnades where merchants displayed goods and philosophers lingered with students. Temples dotted its perimeter, small shrines tucked between stalls, reminding passers-by that commerce and devotion were never far apart. Statues of heroes and statesmen watched from pedestals, their bronze faces gazing down on the crowds, while at the center, ordinary Athenians moved through their routines. At dawn, the Agora began to stir. Farmers from the countryside arrived first, guiding mules laden with baskets of figs, jars of olive oil, or bundles of firewood. Their sandals scuffed the stones as they set up stalls, laying out produce in neat rows. Women carried woven baskets filled with herbs, honey, and eggs. Fishermen, their clothes still smelling of salt and sea, unloaded baskets of glistening catch, arranging them on wooden boards while flies buzzed and children pointed curiously at the strange shapes. Merchants soon followed, their stalls cluttered with imported goods, pottery from Corinth, wine from the islands, bronze tools and trinkets from far-off lands. Fabrics dyed in deep purple or bright saffron caught the morning light, their colors standing out against the dusty backdrop. Buyers gathered, inspecting the quality of wool, testing the sharpness of blades, or haggling over the price of grain. Voices rose and fell in negotiation, sometimes sharp, sometimes playful, but always part of the steady rhythm of commerce. Yet the Agora was never just about goods. It was also about voices. The hum of the marketplace carried gossip as readily as it carried the cries of merchants. News of battles, decrees of the assembly, or the scandal of a neighbor's household spread from mouth to mouth, often twisted with each telling. A farmer might arrive with stories from the countryside of raiders or poor harvests. A soldier might share rumors of Spartan movements. Housewives exchanged complaints about rising prices, while youths whispered about politics or debated the latest performance at the theater. Officials patrolled the Agora, ensuring order amid the bustle. The agoranomoi, market inspectors, checked weights and measures, making sure merchants did not cheat buyers with false scales. They examined bread loaves for size, ensuring bakers did not sell short portions. Fishmongers were watched especially closely, for selling spoiled fish was a notorious crime in Athens. Punishments could be harsh, but the very act of oversight gave the Agora its sense of fairness, a structure within its chaos. Religion, too, was woven into daily routine. Shrines dotted the Agora, small altars where incense curled into the air, where passers-by paused to murmur a prayer before buying bread or selling figs. The temple of Hephaestus stood nearby, honoring the god of craftsmen, its columns rising above the marketplace like a guardian of work and trade. Sacrifices were small, but they reminded Athenians that even the buying of grain or the selling of fish existed under the watchful eyes of the gods. And then there were the philosophers. For many, the Agora was not simply a market but a classroom. Socrates in particular made the Agora his stage, wandering from group to group, asking questions that unsettled more than they resolved. What is justice? What is virtue? What does it mean to live well? His shabby clothes and bare feet made him stand out among merchants and officials, yet his voice carried far. Young men gathered, eager to spar with words rather than coins. Older citizens frowned, accusing him of wasting time or corrupting youth, but still his presence was part of the agora's life. Commerce and philosophy, gossip and religion all flowed together here. To spend a day in the agora was to see the city itself, not the grand processions of festivals, not the solemn debates of the assembly, but the ordinary exchanges that made Athens breathe. The agora was where politics began, as citizens gathered to discuss decrees before walking to the Nix to vote. It was where reputations were made and ruined, where debts were settled, where friendships blossomed over cups of watered wine. And always there was sound. The agora murmured constantly. The shuffle of sandals, the clink of coins, the bray of donkeys, the call of vendors praising their goods. Children darted between stalls, beggars extended their hands, entertainers played flutes or juggled for small coins. Life here was never still, never silent, but always moving, always layered with voices that blurred into a kind of music. To fall asleep here, among the murmur of Athenians going about their business, was to enter the true rhythm of the city. Not the glory of its battles, not the brilliance of its tragedies, but the daily negotiations, complaints, prayers, and purchases that sustained its people. And as the sun climbed higher, as shadows shortened and the marketplace filled, you could not help but wonder, in a city so dependent on its agora, what would happen if the voices ever fell silent? Section 2. Citizenship, Class, and the Agora's Social Web. If you remained in the agora after the first bustle of dawn, you would notice something subtle yet profound. The way the marketplace was not merely a place to buy and sell, but a mirror of Athenian society itself. It was here, among the dusty stones and shaded stoas, that Athens' social order quietly revealed itself, not through speeches in the assembly or statues on the Acropolis, but in the small rituals of trade, conversation, and belonging. The agora drew every class of person, yet it never let them forget who they were. Freeborn citizens, foreign residents, enslaved laborers, and women each had their own place in this social tapestry, marked not by walls or fences but by invisible lines of custom and expectation. The free male citizen stood at the center of this world. He came not only to purchase bread or oil, but to hear and to be heard. Citizenship in Athens was not a passive state, it was an active role, and the agora was one of its stages. Men gathered in clusters to discuss decrees passed by the assembly, to argue over upcoming trials in the law courts, or to share their views on the city's foreign policy. To linger here was to practice democracy informally, in the murmur of voices before the official vote was cast on the Nix. Resident foreigners, known as metics, also moved through the agora. They might be merchants selling imported goods, Egyptian papyrus, Thracian slaves, or spices from far-off markets. Though they could never vote or hold office, their presence was vital, for they carried the trade networks that enriched Athens. Many kept shops at the edges of the agora, their goods reminding Athenians that their city was not self-contained but connected to the wider Mediterranean. Yet, despite their contributions, metics were always outsiders, reminded of their status through taxes and restrictions, their voices absent in the political hum. Women's presence in the agora was quieter, though not absent. Respectable Athenian women rarely lingered. Their duties were thought to belong within the home. Yet they came nonetheless, often with slaves in tow, to purchase wool, oil, or food for their households. Some were widows or poor women who sold goods themselves, small bundles of herbs, woven cloth, or simple pottery. Their participation was tolerated, even necessary, but it reminded all who passed that the agora was not fully theirs. Athenian ideals kept them at the margins, though the reality of daily life pulled them into its flow. Slaves were everywhere. They carried baskets for their masters, managed stalls on behalf of their owners, and hurried through the crowds with errands. Some were skilled artisans, trusted to handle trade. Others were simply runners, their bodies marked by the burden of labor. Their presence made the agora function smoothly, Yet it also served as a quiet reminder of Athens' contradictions. The same city that praised freedom and democracy relied heavily on unfree labor to sustain its daily life. At the edge of the agora stood the law courts, their porticos filled with jurors drawn from the citizen body. Trials were public events, and the agora often served as the waiting room where accusers, defendants, and curious onlookers gathered. Here, the weight of reputation hung heavy. A whispered rumor could ruin a man's standing. A poorly delivered speech might cost him his case. Ordinary Athenians watched, listened, and carried the gossip back into the marketplace, where it mingled with the latest prices of figs and fish. The Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, the Stoa of Zeus the Liberator, was another gathering point, a place where officials met, where treaties were displayed, and where citizens came to settle disputes. Its columns offered shade, but its walls also bore inscriptions of laws and decrees. To walk past these words was to be reminded that the agora was not lawless chaos, but a space underwritten by rules, agreements, and expectations. Then there was the Stoa Poikile, the painted stoa, its walls decorated with murals of battles both mythic and recent. Athenians strolling by could gaze at scenes of their ancestors' victories, perhaps pausing to reflect on their own place within the city's story. Here, philosophers such as Zeno of Citium would later gather, founding the Stoic school of thought. But even in earlier days, the painted walls reminded the citizens that commerce and memory shared the same space, that the buying of grain was never far from the memory of war. The agora was also the pulse of economic regulation. Prices were watched carefully. Shortages or gluts quickly spread murmurs of anxiety. If grain ships were delayed, bread sellers raised their costs, and the poor grumbled as they counted out coins. If olive harvests were plentiful, oil flowed cheaply, and the agora hummed with satisfaction. Money itself told a story. The gleaming silver tetradrachm, stamped with the owl of Athena, passed from hand to hand, reminding all of the city's wealth drawn from its mines at Laurion. Each transaction carried within it a reminder of Athens' resources, its dependencies, and its fragility. Yet, beyond goods and politics, the agora was also about visibility. To walk through it was to be seen, to perform one's role in society. A wealthy citizen might purchase fine imported cloth, his gesture noted by others as proof of his prosperity. A young man might linger near Socrates, signaling his interest in philosophy. A politician might pause at the center, ensuring he was recognized before delivering a speech on the Phoenix. The agora was both market and theater, a place where Athenians played the roles assigned by birth, wealth, or ambition. And through all this, the murmur of voices never ceased. The agora carried not only the sounds of trade but the weight of expectation, the constant reminders of who belonged where. For some, it was a space of empowerment, a stage to express citizenship and participate in the life of the city. For others, it was a place of exclusion, where the limits of freedom were made clear in each transaction and each silence. As the sun climbed and the heat settled over the stones, you could not help but wonder, in this space where commerce and politics mingled so seamlessly, did Athenians ever pause to see the contradictions? Did they sense the tension between freedom and dependence, between equality and exclusion? Or did the murmur of the agora simply carry them forward, too steady and too familiar to provoke deeper reflection? Section 3. Crisis, Continuity, and the Echo of the Agora. If you lingered in the agora long enough, you would begin to notice something else. Its rhythms were not always steady. The marketplace, like Athens itself, could be shaken by events that disrupted its flow. Yet even in moments of crisis, the agora endured, reshaping itself to meet the times, holding within it the resilience of the city. War was one of the most visible intrusions. During the long years of conflict with Sparta, the agora bore scars both subtle and profound. The arrival of refugees from the countryside filled its open space with displaced families, their belongings piled high, their voices carrying worry into the usual hum. Soldiers marched through its paths, their armor clattering against the stones as they prepared for campaigns or returned with stories of battle. Discussions shifted from prices of figs to the progress of fleets, from household gossip to the fate of allies. The war also disrupted trade. Grain shipments from the Black Sea grew uncertain under the shadow of Spartan naval power. Merchants raised prices, bakers grew stingy with their loaves, and inspectors worked harder than ever to keep order. Tension lingered in the air, not only from the fear of defeat, but from the strain of scarcity. Still, the agora persisted, adapting to the shortages, its stalls carrying what goods they could muster, its conversations carrying both hope and complaint. Plague brought a different kind of disruption. When disease swept through Athens in the early years of the Peloponnesian War, the agora changed in tone. Where once its murmur carried laughter, bargaining, and debate, it now carried coughs and silence. Fear marked every exchange, for the illness spread unseen. Families avoided crowds, stalls closed, and the once vibrant marketplace seemed hollow. Yet even in plague, the agora remained the center. Supplies were distributed here, remedies were debated, prayers were offered at its shrines. The place where Athenians once gathered for life became the place they gathered in desperation, seeking survival in the midst of death. Political upheaval also rippled through the agora. Decrees posted on its walls announced changes in leadership, shifts in alliances, new taxes, and new laws. When oligarchs briefly took control, their presence was felt here, as voices grew hushed and conversations carried undertones of suspicion. When democracy was restored, the agora once again filled with bold discussions, citizens gathering with renewed confidence. Its stones bore silent witness to the city's transformations, the changes of government recorded not only in documents but in the daily murmurs of the crowd. Through all of this, the agora remained more than a marketplace. It was the memory of the city. Its statues, stoas, and inscriptions outlasted the turmoil of any one day. Citizens who quarreled over fish prices might also have walked past decrees of alliance with distant states. A young man buying sandals could glance at murals of legendary battles. Every errand was layered with history. Every step through its space reminded Athenians of their identity. In quieter times, festivals restored the agora to a place of celebration. Processions wound their way through its open square, altars received offerings, and musicians filled the air with sound. Vendors prepared special foods, garlands of flowers decorated stalls, and the hum of the market turned festive. These moments reminded Athenians that their agora was not only about survival, but about joy, about the shared rituals that gave meaning to their city. And yet, the agora was never eternal. As centuries passed, it changed. Roman rule reshaped its layout, new stoas and temples rose, old structures crumbled. The murmur of Athenian democracy gave way to different voices, different rulers, different rhythms. Still, the essence of the agora survived, a place where people gathered, where commerce and conversation met, where the life of a city could be read in the simplest exchanges. To fall asleep in the agora of ancient Athens and to awaken centuries later in another marketplace would be to hear an echo of the same sound: footsteps, bargaining, gossip, prayers, complaints, laughter. Markets endure, for they hold within them the daily needs of life. And in their endurance they preserve something deeper than monuments or battles. They preserve the hum of ordinary existence. As the sun lowered over the Athenian agora, casting long shadows across its stones, you might ask yourself, in this steady rhythm of buying and selling, of gossip and debate, of crisis and continuity, what truly sustained Athens? Was it its battles, its philosophers, its monuments? Or was it this murmur, the persistent, unglamorous, ordinary pulse of the agora that gave the city its life? Story 5. The Echo of the Theater. Drama, Ritual, and Drowsy Audiences. Section 1. Setting the stage in Dionysus' shadow. If you drifted asleep in ancient Athens and awoke not in the bustling agora but on the stone seats of the theater, you would find yourself in a space both sacred and social. The theater of Dionysus, carved into the southern slope of the Acropolis, was no ordinary gathering place. It was at once a place of worship, entertainment, civic duty, and community memory. To sit there, with the rising sun casting its light across the marble, was to witness one of the city's most enduring rituals, the performance of drama. The theater was tied to Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. It was in his honor that Athenians gathered for festivals, particularly the city Dionysia, when tragedies and comedies were performed before vast audiences. The performances were not simply entertainment, they were offerings. Plays unfolded as part of a sacred calendar, moments when the city turned its collective gaze toward the stage, seeking both reflection and release. The structure itself was vast. Rows of stone benches fanned upward in a semicircle, capable of holding thousands of spectators. From the lowest seats reserved for priests and officials to the highest benches where ordinary citizens squinted at the stage, the theater was a leveling ground, yet still marked by rank. The orchestra, a circular space at the center, hosted the chorus, whose songs and dances guided the narrative. Behind them stood the skene, a simple structure serving as backdrop and dressing space. No elaborate sets existed, only painted panels or symbolic props, yet the imagination of Athenians filled the space with palaces, temples, and distant battlefields. When the festival began, the theater came alive at dawn. Citizens filed in, dressed in their cloaks, carrying food for the long day ahead. Priests conducted rituals, sacrifices were made, and the presence of the god was invoked. The audience, restless and expectant, waited for the chorus to begin its song. Soon the actors, masked and robed, took their places, and the city gave itself over to drama. The performances were long, often lasting an entire day. A single tragedian would present a trilogy of plays, followed by a satyr play, a lighter piece meant to bring relief after the weight of tragedy. Comedies followed on other days, filled with sharp wit, political satire, and bawdy humor. The audience endured heat, discomfort, and endless hours of words and music. Yet they came, for the theater was as much a civic duty as a pleasure. Attendance was considered an extension of citizenship, part of the shared experience of democracy. The chorus, central to Greek drama, was more than background. Its members danced and sang in unison, their voices rising and falling with solemn weight. They commented on the action, offered moral reflection, and represented the broader community. To hear their steady chant, punctuated by the rhythm of flutes and drums, was to be lulled into a collective trance, a slow meditation on fate, justice, and the gods. Tragedy carried the heaviest weight. Stories of kings undone by pride, families torn apart by vengeance, and mortals crushed by divine will filled the stage. The audience, familiar with the myths, did not come for surprise, but for recognition. They knew Oedipus would fall, that Agamemnon would be slain, that Medea's wrath would not be checked. The power lay not in what would happen, but in how it would unfold. The measured speeches, the chorus's lament, the actors' gestures magnified by their masks. Masks themselves were essential. Large, stylized faces with exaggerated features allowed actors to project across the vast theater. They were not disguises, but symbols, transforming individuals into types: the grieving mother, the wrathful king, the cunning slave. Behind the mask, a single actor could play multiple roles, shifting identity with a change of costume. The audience, trained in this language of symbols, accepted the transformation without question. Yet, for all its grandeur, the theater was also mundane. Spectators shifted on hard stone seats, grew restless in the heat, and muttered about the skill of the actors. Vendors wandered the aisles, selling food and drink. Children fidgeted, old men dozed, and citizens whispered about politics even as the chorus sang. The theater was sacred, yes, but it was also ordinary, a place where thousands of lives intersected in the slow rhythm of shared watching. The experience was not passive. Athenians judged the plays, awarding prizes to the best dramatists. The competition was fierce, for to win at the city Dionysia was a mark of eternal honor. Names like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes echoed through the centuries, but in their own time they were simply participants in the contest, subject to the approval or scorn of the audience. Citizens voted, and the results were recorded, a blend of art and politics inscribed into the life of the city. And so, to doze in the theater, lulled by the chorus's chanting and the endless drone of speeches, was not to miss history, but to experience it in its truest form: slow, repetitive, communal. The plays unfolded not as quick diversions but as meditations. Their weight carried in hours of performance, their meaning absorbed like the warmth of the sun on stone. As the chorus circled, chanting to Dionysus, you might find yourself asking, what did Athenians truly seek in these endless dramas? Was it moral instruction, civic unity, divine communion, or simply the chance to gather together, to murmur, laugh, weep, and doze as one city beneath the gaze of the gods? Section 2. The Audience and the Ritual of Watching. If you stayed in the theater of Dionysus long after the first notes of the chorus echoed across the stone, you would begin to notice that the true drama of the day was not only on the stage but in the audience itself. To watch the Athenians watching was to see another performance, one quieter, slower, and just as revealing. The theater was not an individual experience. It was a gathering of the city. Citizens of every rank filled the seats, row upon row of bodies leaning forward or slumping back. The poor were not excluded. A fund known as the Theoricon helped cover the price of admission so that all citizens could attend. For Athens, theater was not a luxury for the few, but a duty of the many. Even the humblest farmer or craftsman was expected to share in this ritual of seeing and listening. Yet attendance was not uniform. The front rows, the prohedria, were reserved for priests, magistrates, and honored guests. Their presence gave the festival its sacred authority. Behind them sat the ordinary citizens, squeezed together in the hard stone benches, shaded only by their cloaks if the sun grew too harsh. Foreigners and visitors found places as well, curious to observe Athenian culture at its height. The seating arrangement itself reflected the city's layers, but once the chorus began, all were bound in the same act of listening. The audience's engagement varied as the hours passed. In the early morning, attention was sharp. Citizens leaned forward, eager to hear the opening lines, to judge the skill of the actors, to catch the first notes of the chorus. By midday, however, fatigue set in. The sun rose high, shadows vanished, and the length of the performances pressed heavily upon the body. Some shifted uncomfortably on the stone seats, their legs stiff and their backs aching. Others unwrapped food, bread, figs, cheese, and ate as the chorus sang. The experience was not silent reverence but endurance, a slow passage of time shared by thousands. Children fidgeted. Their parents hushed them, but the restlessness spread, a reminder that theater was not always gripping for the youngest spectators. Old men dozed, their heads nodding as speeches rolled on. Vendors moved quietly through the aisles, offering olives, nuts, or watered wine to sustain the weary. The play might be tragic, its themes lofty and grave, but the needs of the body remained mundane. The echo of the chorus mixed with the crunch of bread, the murmur of whispered comments, the occasional cough. Still, moments of intensity broke through. A well-delivered line, a sudden entrance, a sharp cry from the chorus could pull the audience back into attention. When the messenger in a tragedy revealed the fate of a hero, murmurs swept the crowd. When a comic actor delivered a biting joke about a politician, laughter rang out, sharp and knowing. The audience was not passive, it responded, it judged, it remembered. Yet these bursts of energy were framed by long stretches of quiet observation, of listening that blurred into daydreaming. The sense of ritual was inescapable. Plays were performed not in isolation, but as part of a festival. Citizens had processed into the theater together, following priests and sacrifices. The god Dionysus had been honored before the first line was spoken. To watch was to participate in a sacred act, even if one's attention drifted, even if one's eyelids grew heavy in the afternoon sun. The theater was as much about being present as about being alert. Political weight also hovered in the air. Many plays, especially comedies, spoke directly to the concerns of the city. Aristophanes mocked leaders, ridiculed policies, and lampooned public figures. The audience laughed, but beneath the humor lay recognition. The stage was a mirror of their own city, their own choices. Tragedies, too, carried political undertones. Though set in mythic times, they asked questions relevant to Athens, about justice, power, pride, and the consequences of war. The citizens listening were not detached. They were reflecting, consciously or unconsciously, on their own democracy. Yet the most striking feature of the audience was its endurance. From dawn until dusk, citizens remained. They watched trilogies of tragedies, satyr plays, and comedies, each performance long and demanding. No intermissions offered escape. No modern diversions softened the hours. To attend was to commit, to give one's day to the collective act of listening and witnessing. Fatigue was not failure. It was part of the experience. To drift into drowsiness during a long speech, to wake at the sound of the chorus was itself an Athenian rhythm. In the pauses between plays, the theater itself became a place of gossip and exchange. Citizens discussed the skill of actors, the sharpness of lines, the merits of rival playwrights. They also whispered about politics, shared news from the assembly, or spread rumors of private lives. The theater, like the agora, was a space where voices mingled, where civic life extended into casual conversation. Drama was the focus, but the audience created its own performance in the murmurs between acts. And so, as you sat among them, lulled by the steady drone of speech and chant, you might realize that the true essence of Athenian theater was not simply the plays but the act of gathering. It was the shared discomfort, the shared laughter, the shared silence. To be part of the audience was to affirm one's place in the city, to participate in a ritual that bound together gods, citizens, and stories. As the afternoon stretched on and the final play of the day began, one question lingered. In these endless hours of words and song, did Athenians find themselves transformed, or did they simply endure, marking time together under the watch of Dionysus? Section 3. The Legacy of Ancient Drama. As the last shadows of evening crept across the theater of Dionysus, the performances drew to a close. The voices of the actors quieted, the chorus delivered its final lines, and the citizens began to rise, stretching weary limbs after a day of sitting, listening, and drifting between wakefulness and thought. The air carried a strange mixture of fatigue and fulfillment. For the Athenians, the day had not been wasted. It had been devoted to the gods, to the city, and to the shared experience of story. The walk home was slow, almost ritualistic. Citizens descended from the Acropolis slopes, their sandals scraping against the dust of the paths. They murmured about the plays they had seen, comparing tragedies, debating which playwright had captured the essence of the city most truthfully. Some dismissed the day's works as dull or overly long. Others praised their depth. But whether bored or moved, all had been marked by the experience. The act of attending bound them together as surely as the stones of the theater itself. What, then, was left behind when the performances ended? The legacy of Athenian drama was more than the memory of individual plays. It was a lasting imprint on the way the city thought and spoke. Tragedy had taught Athenians to wrestle with the weight of choice and consequence. Through the misfortunes of kings and heroes, citizens saw reflections of their own democracy, how pride might lead to downfall, how anger could unravel a city, how the pursuit of justice was never simple. These plays were not merely stories. They were lessons delivered in the language of myth, absorbed into the collective memory of the polis. Even if an audience member dozed through a scene, the themes lingered, retold in fragments at home, in the agora, in the assembly. Comedy, by contrast, left a different legacy. Its laughter was sharper, more immediate. Aristophanes and his peers pulled politics into parody, transforming leaders into caricatures and policies into absurd spectacles. The people laughed, but the laughter carried recognition. In their mirth, Athenians found a release from the tensions of civic life, yet also a form of critique. The legacy of comedy was not just amusement. It was a mirror, a reminder that democracy thrived when citizens could laugh at themselves and their rulers. The rituals surrounding drama were themselves part of the inheritance. The festivals of Dionysus blended religion with art, worship with performance. To attend the theater was not simply to watch entertainment, but to honor the god whose spirit of transformation, excess, and boundary crossing infused every play. In this way, the legacy of drama extended beyond words and characters. It was sacred, woven into the very fabric of Athenian identity, and yet, beneath these lofty themes, another legacy endured, the legacy of endurance itself. The act of spending an entire day in the theater, of sitting on stone, of squinting against the sun, of shifting restlessly through endless speeches, taught Athenians the value of shared patience. They endured together. They learned that culture was not always swift or easy, but slow, heavy, and communal. To be an Athenian was to shoulder this weight, to participate in rituals that required time as much as attention. Over the centuries, the voices of those actors faded, the masks crumbled, the costumes wore away, the playwrights passed into silence. Yet the plays themselves remained, carried forward in written form, studied by later generations. The Romans adopted them, reshaped them, performed them in their own arenas. Centuries later, scholars pored over the texts, reviving them on stages far from Athens. The legacy stretched outward, like ripples from a stone cast into water, reaching lands and ages the Athenians themselves could never have imagined. Today, when we speak of drama, when we sit in theaters or watch stories unfold on screens, we are still in conversation with Athens. The very structure of plays, the rise and fall, the conflict and resolution, was etched into cultural memory by those early tragedies and comedies. Even our sense of audience, the expectation that stories can both entertain and instruct, is part of what the Athenians bequeathed to the world. But perhaps the deepest legacy is not artistic form or political satire. It is the memory of gathering, the image of thousands of citizens sitting shoulder to shoulder, watching together, enduring together, drifting into drowsiness together. The theater was a mirror of Athens itself, noisy, restless, thoughtful, proud, prone to laughter, vulnerable to fatigue, yet bound in a shared ritual that gave meaning to the city's life. As night fell and the last spectators disappeared into the winding streets, the empty theater stood silent, its stone seats cool beneath the stars. Yet in that silence the echoes remained. The chorus, the speeches, the laughter, the sighs, the yawns of a drowsy audience. Those echoes traveled through time, carrying with them the slow, enduring rhythm of Athenian drama. And so, when we think of the legacy of ancient theater, we should not imagine only the brilliance of playwrights or the grandeur of performance. We should also imagine the patient crowd, the stone benches, the weary bodies leaning together in the sunlight. For it was not only the words of Sophocles or Aristophanes that survived, it was the collective act of listening, the willingness to share in stories, however long, however slow, however heavy with silence. This was the true echo of the theater, not a single voice but a chorus of citizens, enduring and remembering, long after the plays themselves had ended. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time, to uncover the strange, forgotten ways people once tried to sleep. From noble chambers to peasant huts, the night looked very different than it does for us. If you've ever wondered how people found rest in a world without electricity, tonight's story is for you. Close your eyes. Imagine the silence of a medieval castle, only the flicker of candlelight and the sound of your own breath. Sleep was never just sleep. It was ritual, survival, and sometimes even politics. Before we drift off together, let's wander into the forgotten world of nighttime, where kings turned their beds into thrones and peasants curled on straw under smoky rafters. If you're still awake, perhaps leave a quiet comment. Tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy drifting through these slow journeys into the past, a gentle tap on subscribe will keep you close for the next story. Maybe share this with a friend who also struggles to fall asleep. History is always better when it's shared. And if you'd like, whisper into the comments what kind of history you'd like to dream through next. Your ideas might guide the next night's story. When you imagine the Roman Empire, you might think of gleaming marble temples, the thunder of marching legions, or the roar of a crowded amphitheater. But let us slow down and step gently into another side of Rome. Imagine the sun setting beyond the 7 hills as the day fades into shadows. The Eternal City, so full of life during the daylight hours, took on another kind of energy when night arrived. The streets of Rome were not built for quiet. Cobblestones echoed with every footstep. Even the sound of a mule's hooves could travel across narrow alleys. At dusk, oil lamps flickered into life along some of the busier streets, but much of the city remained in darkness. Unlike the calm silence we may associate with nighttime in small towns, Rome's nights were a mixture of whispers, movement, and distant echoes. You might picture yourself standing at the edge of the Forum Romanum as the final merchants pack away their goods. The chatter of the crowd dies down, but in its place, new sounds emerge. The rattle of cartwheels over stone, the laughter of tavern-goers spilling into the streets. Somewhere in the distance, water splashes into a fountain, its rhythm broken by the uneven drip of ancient pipes. For the ordinary Roman, night was not simply a time of rest. Many households, especially those in cramped apartments, were too hot and noisy during the day to allow for deep sleep. People often ventured outside after sunset when the air was cooler. Conversations that could not take place during busy daylight hours stretched on in the dim light of a torch. But with darkness came uncertainty. Roman nights carried both opportunity and risk. You could share wine with friends at a popina or tavern, yet also face pickpockets in the alleys. You might hear neighbors singing softly or quarrels breaking out over spilled drinks. And always there were the stray animals. Dogs scavenging through the rubbish, donkeys tied up at doorways, cats slinking along walls. Their noises joined the human ones, adding to the restless chorus of the city. Let us pause and notice how carefully the Romans balanced between fear and familiarity at night. They lacked the streetlights we take for granted today. Instead, they relied on oil lamps, which provided little more than a halo of light. Some wealthy households had servants to carry torches, but most people walked cautiously in the dark. This made even the simplest nightly errand an exercise in trust and awareness. Think of the way smells carried through the night air. A baker might begin his work long before dawn, filling the streets with the faint aroma of bread. At the same time, the drains that ran beneath Rome released less pleasant odors. The mixture of these scents, smoke from cooking fires, damp stone, refuse, and perfume, created an atmosphere that was never neutral, always alive. And then there were the voices. Rome was a city of many languages, with travelers, traders, and enslaved people arriving from across the empire. At night, you might hear fragments of Greek, Egyptian, or Gaulish words floating in the darkness. To walk through the city after sunset was to hear a constant murmur, a blend of tongues that marked Rome as both familiar and foreign at the same time. For those who lived near the great public baths, nights were particularly lively. Although baths officially closed in the evening, people often lingered in nearby courtyards, chatting or making deals. For others, the taverns provided an escape from the day's work. Wine was cheap, diluted, and widely consumed, making drunken songs and arguments a regular feature of Roman nights. The calm silence we often expect after sunset was almost impossible to find in the Eternal City. But beneath this surface liveliness lay something deeper. Rome's night carried with it a sense of unease. The darkness made it easier for crimes to occur. Petty thefts were common, and violence was never far away. The Roman poet Juvenal once remarked on the dangers of walking through the city after dark, describing how drunken men might pick fights or wealthy citizens might be ambushed. The city was awake, but not always safe. And so, as we step further into this world, we begin to see that Roman nights were not quiet at all. They were restless, layered, and filled with small details that revealed the life of the city. From the sound of sandals on stone to the distant call of a watchman, the Eternal City hummed with energy, even when the rest of the empire slept. But this leaves us with a question, one that lingers like the flicker of an oil lamp. If Rome never truly slept, what systems kept the city alive and protected when shadows grew deep? Who watched over the streets, and how did ordinary people learn to live in a city where nights were never entirely safe? Section 2. Guardians, Dangers, and the Restless Night. When you think about a city that never sleeps, it may sound lively, even comforting. But in ancient Rome, the truth was far more complex. The same streets that carried laughter and conversation could also be the stage for theft, unrest, and sudden quarrels. Night in the Eternal City was a delicate balance between enjoyment and risk. And at the heart of this balance were those whose task it was to keep Rome's nights from collapsing into chaos. Let us walk slowly through this picture. Imagine yourself standing beneath an archway, the cool stone behind your back, watching the street. A faint glow comes from a nearby tavern, where voices rise and fall like the tide. Across the road, a man carrying a basket of bread shuffles toward the bakery, preparing dough for the dawn. But nearby, a shadow lingers too long, watching, waiting, blending into the dimness. The Romans were aware of these shadows, and so they created their own system of guardianship. By the time of Augustus, the first emperor, an organized body known as the Vigiles patrolled the city at night. These men served both as watchmen and as firefighters, for Rome was as vulnerable to flames as it was to crime. Built largely of wood, the insulae, the tall, crowded apartment blocks, were especially prone to fire. A single oil lamp knocked over could set a household ablaze. The Vigiles moved through the city with torches, water buckets, and basic equipment. Their presence was meant to reassure citizens, but their effectiveness was uneven. Many were former slaves, given this duty as a form of service. They were not highly respected, nor were they always well trained. Yet they were essential, for without them, Rome's nights would have been left entirely unguarded. As you picture them walking the cobblestones, notice how their footsteps echoed against the stone walls. A torch flared, casting brief light on the road before fading back into shadow. The vigils listened for shouts of alarm, sniffed for the acrid scent of smoke, and watched for groups of men gathering in suspicious ways. Their work was unending, for the city was too large to ever be entirely safe. Yet, even with the Vigiles, fear remained. Juvenal, the poet who so often complained of Rome's discomforts, spoke of how dangerous it could be to leave one's home after dark. He described how a wealthy citizen might be followed by drunken revelers, eager to provoke a fight, or how a thief might seize upon the cover of darkness to snatch away valuables. Some people chose to travel with servants for protection, their torches held high to ward off both shadows and suspicion. But of course, danger was not only from thieves or quarrels. Fires were an ever-present threat, and the vigils were often called to battle flames that spread quickly through dry timbers. Imagine the sound of buckets being passed from hand to hand, the cries of panic, the frantic rush to save belongings. Even if the fire was contained, the smell of smoke could linger in a neighborhood for days, a reminder of how fragile safety was after sunset. Meanwhile, those who did not fear crime or fire still faced another kind of disturbance: noise. Rome was not a quiet place, even at midnight. The movement of carts, officially banned during the day to reduce congestion, often took place at night instead. Wheels ground against stone, mules brayed, drivers shouted instructions, and the echo of iron-bound wheels carried far. For those trying to sleep in crowded apartments, rest was often broken by the rattle of commerce in motion. There were also the taverns, which spilled their energy into the streets. Drinking songs rose, arguments broke out, and occasionally fights spilled into the open. Roman taverns were not genteel places. They were crowded, smoky, and filled with a mix of locals and travelers. To pass by one at night was to hear a mixture of laughter, shouting, and the clatter of cups. In this way, Roman nights were never fully peaceful. Even when danger did not touch you directly, its presence was always near. Fires, thefts, quarrels, and noise were woven into the fabric of the city. Yet, at the same time, life went on. Families gathered in their homes, whispering stories to one another before bed. Street vendors quietly prepared for dawn markets, and the vigils continued their patrols, their torches glowing faintly as they disappeared into the next street. What we find, then, is a picture of contrast. The night was a time of vulnerability, yet also of connection. It was a time when bakers began their labor, when neighbors spoke more softly than they did by day, when travelers made their way through the city under the stars. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also profoundly human. Still, a question remains. If nights in Rome were restless and fraught with risk, how did ordinary people learn to adapt? What habits, rituals, and quiet strategies allowed them to find rest in a city that seemed designed to keep them awake? Section 3. Adapting to the night. If the night in Rome was never fully safe, never fully silent, then how did its people live with it? How did men and women, rich and poor alike, learn to rest, to find balance, and to carry on their lives in a city that hummed and stirred long after sunset? Let us move slowly through these questions. For the Romans, night was not simply an inconvenience. It was a rhythm of life, one they learned to navigate in quiet and practical ways. Families living in the insulae, those tall and crowded apartment buildings, often created their own patterns of nightly adaptation. Windows were shuttered with wooden panels, and heavy cloths were hung inside to muffle sound. In some households, people slept in shifts, so that someone was always awake to watch over the family's possessions. In others, the closeness of neighbors meant that the sounds of daily life blended together until they became background noise, accepted rather than resisted. Wealthier Romans, of course, had different strategies. Those who lived in domus, or private townhouses, retreated into inner courtyards that provided some separation from the noise of the streets. Servants might be stationed near doors or gates to ensure safety. Lamps burned more freely, casting steady light in rooms decorated with mosaics and frescoes. The wealthy could afford privacy, and with it, a little more silence. But even among the elite, night carried its challenges. There were superstitions about spirits and omens, and many Romans believed that the boundary between the human world and the divine was thinner at night. Household gods, the lares and penates, were offered small prayers before bedtime. Charms were hung above doorways. A simple whispered invocation to a protective deity might provide comfort when the city outside seemed restless. Ordinary Romans also adapted by making use of the night rather than resisting it. Bakers, as we have mentioned, began their work in the quiet hours, kneading dough and heating ovens so that bread would be ready by dawn. Street sweepers cleared away debris from the previous day. Water carriers prepared to refill cisterns and public fountains. For these people, night was not an interruption of life, but an essential part of its continuation. There were also quieter, more personal adaptations. Families told stories by lamplight, passing down tales of ancestors or fables from the wider empire. Children learned to fall asleep to the murmur of voices. the scrape of a cart in the distance, the occasional bark of a dog. For them, these sounds were not disturbing. They were simply part of the world they knew. And what of those who struggled to rest? Some sought relief in the baths, sneaking in before official hours to enjoy the warm water. Others relied on wine, dulling the noise of the city with drink. Still others joined in the nighttime life itself, finding comfort in the company of neighbors at taverns or watching the stars above the rooftops. The Roman night was not uniform. It could be threatening or comforting, depending on how one approached it. We might also consider the way Romans measured time. They did not divide days and nights as we do, with precise hours and minutes. Instead, they spoke of watches and intervals. The night was broken into 4 watches, each lasting roughly 3 hours, marked by changes of duty among guards or vigiles. For those lying awake, these divisions provided a sense of structure, a way to measure the progress of darkness toward dawn. In this way, the Roman night was both a challenge and an opportunity. It demanded adaptation, but it also created new spaces for human life to unfold, spaces for work, for quiet rituals, for whispered conversations that might not have taken place in the busyness of the day. And when the first light of morning crept over the horizon, the city stirred once again. Merchants prepared their stalls, citizens made their way to the forum, and children hurried through narrow alleys. The noises of night faded into memory, replaced by the sounds of another bustling day. Yet the restless energy never truly vanished. For as soon as the sun set again, the eternal city would once more reveal its other self, noisy, restless, and alive under the cover of darkness. Perhaps that is the lesson we carry forward. Even in an age without electric lights or modern distractions, nights were never silent. Human life filled them, just as it fills our nights today. And so the whispers of Rome remind us that rest is always relative, and that the search for quiet in a city is as old as civilization itself. But this leaves us with another thought. If the ordinary streets of Rome were restless, what of the towering tenement blocks, the insulae, where thousands lived crammed together, listening to one another's footsteps and whispers through thin walls? How did those crowded nights shape the lives of Rome's poorest citizens? Story 2. Shadows of the Tenements, Section 1. Life in the Insulae. After sunset, when you think of ancient Rome, it is easy to imagine marble villas, spacious courtyards, and richly decorated halls. But for most Romans, life was not lived in such comfort. The vast majority of the population crowded into tall, narrow apartment buildings known as insulae. These tenements, often built quickly and cheaply, loomed over the city's streets like uneven cliffs of brick and timber. Now, let us step slowly into one of these insulae, not in the bright light of day, but as night descends. The shadows grow long in the stairwells. The lamps flicker, revealing cracked plaster and uneven steps. From the outside, the building looks imposing, rising several stories high. But within, its rooms are small, crowded, and filled with the echoes of daily life. Picture yourself standing in a narrow courtyard, the kind that many insulae possessed at their base. From every floor above, voices drift down. A baby cries, soothed by a tired mother. A pot clatters as someone finishes cooking their evening meal. Wooden shutters creak as neighbors lean out to exchange words across the alley. The sounds are layered, overlapping, and never quite still. As darkness spreads, the insula come alive in a different way. Oil lamps are lit, but their glow barely reaches beyond a room's center. Shadows cling to the corners, stretching across the walls. The smell of smoke and cooking lingers in the air, mixing with dampness rising from the ground. For families crowded into single rooms, night was not a time of silence, but of adjustment. The wealthier tenants lived on the lower floors, where the walls were sturdier and the rooms more spacious. These families had better access to water, sometimes even their own small hearths. Their lamps burned brighter and their doors were more secure. But higher up, conditions grew steadily worse. The upper floors were fragile, made of timber and cheap brick, and they swayed with the winds. Here, poor families huddled together, sometimes 5 or 6 to a single room. Space was tight, and privacy was almost unknown. At night, the difference between these floors became even clearer. On the ground level, wealthier families might enjoy a quieter evening, with servants tending to the lamps or carrying food from nearby taverns. But on the top floors, the creak of the beams, the chatter of neighbors through thin walls, and the restless scurrying of rats made it difficult to find rest. Yet life carried on. Children played softly in the dim corridors, their laughter muted but persistent. Women mended clothing by the light of a small lamp. Men returned from their day's work. Laborers, porters, street vendors, tired but talkative, sharing news and gossip before bed. In these close quarters, the night belonged to everyone at once. You could hear your neighbors' prayers, their quarrels, their quiet sighs as they drifted towards sleep. The dangers of the insulae were never far away. Fire was the greatest threat, and the smell of smoke in the air could set entire families on edge. A single accident, a candle overturned, a stove left burning, could sweep through the upper floors in moments. Collapses, too, were feared. Built cheaply, some insulae simply gave way under their own weight, their walls tumbling in the night. The poet Juvenal once remarked bitterly that in Rome, the rich feared fire, while the poor feared both fire and the collapse of their homes. And yet, despite these dangers, the insulae were places of resilience. They were not silent tombs of the poor, but living, breathing spaces filled with ordinary routines. At night, voices softened into whispers, not because the city grew quiet, but because families carved out moments of intimacy amidst the noise. A mother told a story to her child about Hercules or Romulus. An old man recited verses he remembered from youth. Even in the poorest rooms, memory and tradition passed from one generation to the next under the dim glow of an oil lamp. As we pause here in the middle of an insula, we can sense the weight of these nightly routines. The city outside may have been restless, but within these walls, thousands of small dramas unfolded every night. Dramas of survival, of fatigue, of patience. But this leaves us with an open question. If life inside the insulae was so fragile and crowded, how did these communities hold together? What social bonds, unspoken rules, and small acts of cooperation allowed tenants to endure the long nights of Rome's towering tenements? Section 2. Bonds of Survival in the Insulae. When thousands of people live stacked upon one another, separated only by thin walls and creaking beams, the question is not only one of survival, but of community. How did those in Rome's tenements endure the endless nights, when the air was thick with smoke, when footsteps echoed overhead, and when sleep came in fragments rather than in peace? To understand this, we must move carefully through the hidden fabric of insula life. Imagine for a moment the narrow staircases that wound their way upward through these towering structures. By day, they carried the traffic of residents climbing and descending with baskets, jars, and tools. By night, they became quieter pathways, where one neighbor might pause to share a word with another, or where children tiptoed up and down, seeking friends in the dim glow of a lamp. These staircases were not only structural necessities. They were meeting places, the arteries of the community. Within the cramped rooms, families developed nightly routines that overlapped with those of their neighbors. Cooking smells drifted through open doorways, often blending into one another. The hiss of boiling porridge, the crackle of frying fish, or the faint aroma of lentils gave the building its nightly rhythm. One family's meal became part of another family's atmosphere. In such close quarters, privacy was rare, but solidarity was not. People learned to recognize one another's habits, the sound of a baby's cry, the familiar cough of an old man, the footsteps of a neighbor returning late from work. These noises, rather than being resented, were woven into the rhythm of life. They were signals that others were near, that one was not alone in the fragile structure of the insula. Social bonds often grew strongest in times of danger. When fire broke out in the night, residents did not face it alone. Buckets were passed from hand to hand. Families shouted warnings up stairwells. Possessions were gathered quickly, sometimes left behind in the rush. The community acted as one, not because of written laws, but because survival demanded it. But even without crisis, cooperation was constant. Water was not always available in every household, so families relied on one another to share or carry supplies from nearby fountains. Lamps needed oil, and sometimes neighbors pooled their resources. Children often moved freely between families, watched by whichever adult was available. The insula was not a place of isolation, but of shared burdens. At night, these bonds became more visible. After meals were eaten and after work was done, the hours stretched into a quieter, more reflective time. Men sat in doorways, talking softly with neighbors about prices at the market, news from the forum, or the rumors of politics far beyond their reach. Women mended clothing together, exchanging advice on remedies for illness or stories of births and deaths within the building. Children played simple games, their laughter softened but not silenced by the dark. Of course, tensions existed as well. Noise carried too easily, and tempers sometimes flared. Quarrels broke out over spilled water, over debts unpaid, over accusations of theft. Yet even these conflicts were part of the nightly rhythm. The same thin walls that allowed gossip to spread also allowed reconciliation, as disputes cooled and neighbors returned to their routines. The insula, then, was more than just a building. It was a community in motion, where survival depended on shared awareness. To live there was to accept that your life was never entirely your own, that your rest, your meals, your peace were tied to the habits and fortunes of those around you. If we pause here and listen closely to the night within the insula, we hear not just noise, but connection. The quiet murmur of voices across the courtyard, the steady scrape of a hand loom, the faint song of a mother soothing her child. These were not just sounds. They were assurances, reminders that life continued even in fragile surroundings. And yet, one cannot ignore the weariness that came with this life. Nights were rarely restful. Crowded conditions, constant noise, and the weight of poverty pressed heavily on those who lived in the upper stories. Many Romans envied the wealthy, who could close heavy doors and retreat into private rooms. But for those in the insulae, survival was not found in solitude. It was found in togetherness. Still, a question lingers. If the bonds of community allowed the poor of Rome to endure their nights, what toll did this constant pressure take on their bodies and minds? How did the lack of rest, the strain of cramped spaces, and the endless closeness of neighbors shape the health and spirit of those who lived in the shadows of the tenements? Section 3. The toll of night and the endurance of the poor. As we move deeper into the lives of Rome's tenement dwellers, we begin to see not only how they survived the nights, but also what those nights left behind. For while community and routine made life possible in the insulae, the weight of such existence pressed heavily on body and spirit. Let us pause and imagine the setting once more. The room is small, its walls blackened from years of smoke. A single oil lamp flickers, casting weak light across rough plaster. A family lies close together on straw bedding, sharing warmth in the cool night. Overhead, footsteps creak as someone shifts in the floor above. From outside, a mule brays, a cart rumbles, and somewhere, faint singing drifts through the alley. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by sound and worry. This was the nightly reality for countless Romans. The insulae, with their thin walls and overcrowding, offered little protection from noise or disturbance. Rest was shallow. Many people awoke several times in the night, adjusting to the sounds of neighbors or the distant cries of watchmen. For those who rose early to labor, dock workers, porters, vendors, the lack of true sleep wore away at their strength. Fatigue became a constant companion. The health toll was significant. Poor ventilation filled rooms with smoke from cooking fires. Damp air bred illness. Shared latrines spread disease quickly, and the lack of sanitation meant that sickness lingered. Children, especially, suffered from these conditions, their growth stunted, their energy sapped. The night was not a refuge for the poor of Rome, it was another stage of endurance. And yet, endurance was precisely what defined life in the insulae. People adapted in ways both small and profound. Families learned to rest in shifts, so that someone was always alert. Light meals were often taken before bed, making sleep a little easier. Rituals of prayer, whispered softly to the household gods, offered comfort. Even superstitions, charms hung above doorways, murmured invocations against spirits, served as anchors in the darkness. The mental strain, too, was real. Constant noise, lack of privacy, and the ever-present threat of fire or collapse created a sense of unease that never fully vanished. But here again, community acted as a balm. Neighbors leaned on one another, finding solace in shared struggle. A kind word in a stairwell, the lending of a lamp, the watchful eye of a fellow tenant. These small gestures eased the burden of long nights. Over time, this resilience became a part of Roman identity itself. To live in the insula was to be resourceful, to endure discomfort with patience, and to draw strength from others. The wealthy might have envied silence, but the poor understood survival in a way that only shared hardship can teach. When dawn finally broke, the city stirred again. The cries of vendors rose, children spilled into alleys, and workers carried their tools to the Forum and beyond. For those who had endured another restless night in the insula, the new day was not a fresh beginning. It was a continuation of the same cycle. And yet they carried on, finding meaning not in comfort, but in persistence. Perhaps this is what we can take with us. In the shadows of Rome's tenements, we find a reminder that human life endures even in the harshest conditions. The poor of Rome did not enjoy quiet nights, but they learned to live within the noise, to find connection where silence could not exist. Their lives were fragile, their rest uncertain, but their resilience was lasting. And so the question turns outward, reaching to us across centuries. If the poorest Romans could endure nights filled with smoke, noise, and constant worry, how do we endure our own restless nights today? What patterns, what communities, what quiet rituals carry us through the hours when the world feels heavy and sleep feels far away? Story 3. The Watchmen and the Fires section. 1. Flames in the darkness. When you picture the city of Rome, it is easy to see its marble temples, bustling markets, and wide avenues. But beneath all this grandeur, the city was fragile. Built largely of wood, crowded with insulae that leaned against one another like tired giants, Rome was always at risk of fire. And when the sun set, this risk grew sharper. The night was not only noisy, it was dangerous, lit by countless small flames that could at any moment turn into disaster. Let us slow down and imagine the glow of Rome after sunset. Oil lamps burned in doorways, their small flames barely pushing back the dark. In the kitchens of insulae, families lit braziers to cook their evening meals. Torches guided travelers through narrow alleys while taverns spilled light into the streets. All across the city, little flames flickered, necessary for life, but always threatening to consume the very homes they illuminated. Fires were not rare in Rome. They were constant. The poet Martial spoke of them as ordinary hazards of city life. Juvenal described how the poor, living in fragile upper stories, feared the sudden collapse of burning timber. In the silence of night, the crackle of flames or the sudden smell of smoke could send panic through entire neighborhoods. Families rushed to gather what little they owned, blankets, cooking pots, religious charms, before fleeing into the street. To fight this ever-present danger, the city relied on the vigils, a corps created by Augustus in the early 1st century CE. They were Rome's night watchmen, serving as both firefighters and guards. Their task was thankless and difficult. They patrolled the streets with torches, buckets, and axes, listening for cries of alarm. They inspected buildings, searched for signs of smoke, and tried to maintain order when flames broke out. The vigiles were divided into cohorts, stationed across the city's districts. Each cohort was responsible for its own section of Rome, with watchposts set up near major crossroads. At night, they moved in small groups, their footsteps echoing against the stone, their torches glowing faintly in the darkness. For ordinary Romans, the sight of the vigils was both reassuring and humbling. These men were often freedmen, not of noble rank, but they carried the heavy responsibility of keeping the eternal city safe while others slept. Imagine the sound of their work. A sudden alarm breaks out, the shout of "Ignis!" Fire. Buckets are filled with water from nearby fountains. Axes split wooden beams to create fire breaks. Roof tiles are pried loose so that water can be poured down into the heart of a blaze. The cries of families fill the street as they watch their homes threatened by flames. In these moments, the vigiles were not only watchmen, but a fragile barrier between survival and ruin. But even when there was no fire, their presence mattered. Rome was a city of shadows, and the vigiles were a reminder that the city never truly slept. They enforced order in taverns, broke up brawls, and kept an eye on thieves. Their work was not glamorous, and it was never complete. Fires returned, crimes repeated, and still they walked the streets carrying their torches through the restless night. For the wealthy, the vigiles were part of the fabric of city life, quietly doing their duty while senators and merchants rested in secure homes. For the poor, they were both protectors and witnesses. The vigiles saw the fragility of Rome more clearly than anyone. They watched the insulae creak and groan. They smelled the smoke rising from cooking fires, and they knew how quickly disaster could strike. And yet, despite their vigilance, fires continued. Entire neighborhoods were scarred by them, their wooden beams replaced, their walls rebuilt. The Great Fire of 64 CE, during the reign of Nero, showed the terrible power of flames in Rome. But even before and after that famous disaster, smaller fires burned constantly, reminders that the eternal city was never as eternal as it appeared. So, as you lie here, imagining the Roman night, picture not silence, but the uneasy glow of flame. Picture the watchmen moving slowly through the streets, their eyes searching the shadows, their ears tuned to cries of alarm. Picture the families who slept lightly, always ready to flee at the first hint of smoke. And ask yourself, what was it like to live in a city where the night itself carried the threat of fire, where the smallest spark could become a storm of flame? Section 2. The Duties of the Vigiles. If the vigils were Rome's guardians of the night, then their labor was not only about sudden moments of alarm. Much of their work was slower, quieter, and woven into the ordinary hours after sunset. To understand them, we must not only imagine the heat of fire, but also the stillness of watch. Picture a group of vigils beginning their shift. They gather at a small station house, perhaps near a crossroads or beside a fountain. Their equipment is simple: leather buckets for water, hooks and axes for breaking beams, and torches for light. Some carry whistles or horns to sound the alarm. They do not look like soldiers, for they are not legionaries. Many are freedmen, once enslaved, now serving the city in this vital but humble role. The city has been divided into regions, and each cohort of vigiles is responsible for its own section. As darkness settles, small groups fan out, walking the narrow streets. Their sandals tap softly against the stones. Their torches sputter, casting halos of orange light that push back the shadows for only a few steps. To walk with them is to see Rome from the ground, not from the marble temples or the Senate halls, but from the level of doorways and taverns, fountains and alleys. What do they notice first? The smell of smoke, faint but unmistakable, drifting from an insula where a cooking fire has not yet been extinguished. The mutter of voices rising too loudly from a tavern doorway. the shuffle of someone moving quickly through the dark, perhaps carrying more than his own belongings. The vigiles were not magistrates, yet their presence was often enough to settle quarrels or deter thieves. In quieter moments, their work took on a rhythm. They walked their assigned routes, watching the rooftops, listening for cries. They checked on storage areas where hay and straw, so easily set alight, were kept. They ensured that the fountains were in working order, for water was life when flames appeared. Theirs was a labor of vigilance, steady and repetitive, but essential. When a fire did break out, everything changed. Buckets were filled in haste, lines of men passing water hand to hand. Hooks tore at roofs to prevent flames from spreading. Walls were broken open to allow water inside. There was shouting, chaos, the clash of wood and stone. And when the blaze was finally tamed, exhaustion set in. Yet the vigils did not return to rest. They continued their watch, for another spark could appear at any time. The dangers were not only from fire. The vigils also dealt with disturbances that unsettled the night. Drunken quarrels, brawls in taverns, thieves slipping through alleys. These, too, fell under their duty. They were not soldiers, and their authority was limited, but their presence was a reminder that Rome was never unobserved, even in darkness. It was wearying work. The vigils were often mocked by poets, treated as lowly men. They lacked the glory of legionaries, the dignity of senators, or the pride of artisans. Yet in truth, they bore one of the heaviest burdens in the city. Without their steady watch, Rome's nights would have been far more dangerous, its fires more frequent, its people less secure. Imagine, then, the slow pace of their patrols. One torch flickers, then another. The sound of sandals fades, replaced by silence, then returns again. The vigils continue, step after step, night after night. Their work is never finished, their duty never complete. They do not end danger, but they reduce it, making survival possible in a city that might otherwise consume itself. And as dawn approaches, their shift begins to close. The sky lightens, carts return to the streets, bakers open their doors. The vigiles retreat to their stations, weary but unnoticed. Few citizens thank them. Fewer still remember them. Yet their presence has shaped the night, holding back the worst dangers so that the city could continue into another day. Still, we must ask, what does this tell us about Rome itself? What kind of city needed so many watchmen, and yet still feared flame and shadow each night? And how did these men, so often overlooked, shape the survival of a city that called itself eternal? Section 3. Fragile Resilience in the Eternal City. When we think of the Eternal City, we often picture marble columns that seem unshakable, or stone amphitheaters that endure even now. But the truth of Rome was more delicate. Its grandeur stood upon fragile foundations, timber beams, clay tiles, narrow alleys, and crowded tenements. The vigils, those ordinary men of the night, were reminders that the city's permanence depended not on stone, but on vigilance. Let us return to the glow of Rome at night. The lamps have burned low. The voices from taverns have softened. Somewhere a dog barks once, then falls silent. And yet, the city is not sleeping. In some quarter, a vigil's cohort still walks its patrol, torches in hand, watching for the faintest trace of smoke. The stillness is deceptive, for danger is always near. The people of Rome lived with this awareness. Fires were not possibilities. They were certainties. Everyone knew someone who had lost a room, a home, or an entire building. Everyone had seen flames lick the rooftops or smelled the acrid air that followed. The vigils did their best, but the city was too vast, too combustible, too restless for safety to ever be guaranteed. And so, Romans adapted. They kept their possessions light, knowing they might need to flee at any hour. They formed habits of alertness, teaching children to wake quickly at the smell of smoke. They relied on neighbors, on hurried warnings, on the passing of buckets in the night. For the poor in the insulae, this constant risk was part of life, no different from hunger or illness. For the wealthy, it was a reminder that no marble villa could fully keep danger at bay. The vigils themselves embodied this fragility. They were not heroes sung in epic verse. They were freedmen, men of low status, sometimes mocked, sometimes ignored. Yet without them, the city would have burned more often and more fiercely. Their quiet labor, their steady patrols, their readiness to plunge into smoke and flame, these were acts of survival, not only for themselves but for all Rome. Perhaps this is why the night, in Rome, never felt entirely safe. To fall asleep was always to take a risk. The city was too crowded, too combustible, too alive with fire and noise, but perhaps it was also why Romans cherished their small rituals. Prayers whispered to household gods, charms hung above doorways, water jars kept close to hand. These rituals were not just superstition. They were anchors against the uncertainty of the dark. When dawn came, the night's dangers often left few visible traces. The fires were put out, the quarrels forgotten, the vigiles returned to their stations. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But those who lived through it carried the memory. They carried the awareness that the eternal city was strong and yet also fragile, bound together not only by its monuments but by the endurance of ordinary people and the watchmen who guarded them. And so, the story of the vigils is not just about fire. It is about the restless balance of Rome itself, a city that could not rest, yet endured. It is about resilience, about the fragile cooperation of citizens, and about the overlooked labor that allowed the empire's heart to keep beating through the night. Perhaps this is the thought we can carry with us, that civilizations are not kept alive only by emperors or generals, but by those who patrol in the shadows, whose work is rarely remembered, yet whose presence holds back chaos. Rome's nights were never quiet, but within their noise and danger there was endurance. And endurance, more than stone, is what makes a city eternal. But here, another question rises gently in the background. If the vigils kept Rome awake at night with their watchful duties, what of those whose work was not to protect but to trade? What of the markets that opened in darkness, supplying the city before dawn? Could it be that while some guarded against flames, others stoked the fires of commerce, keeping Rome alive in another way? Story 4. Markets that never slept, Session 1. The restless economy of the night. When we think of markets, we often imagine the morning, stalls being set up, merchants calling out, baskets filled with bread, fruit, and fish. But in ancient Rome, the economy did not wait for the rising sun. Long before daylight, while many citizens tried to rest in their crowded rooms, the city's trade was already in motion. The Roman night was alive not only with danger and fire, but also with commerce. Let us imagine the hour before dawn. The sky above Rome is still dark, scattered with faint stars. The streets, though quieter than by day, are never silent. From the Tiber River, carts begin to rumble into the city, carrying goods unloaded at the docks. Mules strain against their harnesses, hooves clattering against cobblestones. Drivers shout to one another, urging their animals forward. This movement was not an inconvenience, it was law. Heavy carts were forbidden from the streets during daylight when the city was too crowded, and so the night became their time. The Forum Holitorium, the vegetable market, stirred before the first light. Farmers and merchants set out their produce, cabbages, onions, beans, and herbs. Their torches and lamps lit up the stalls, casting shadows across baskets and jars. Buyers arrived early, often servants sent on behalf of wealthier households. The air carried a blend of smells, fresh vegetables, damp earth, and the faint smoke of nearby cooking fires. Nearby, the Forum Piscarium, the fish market, was even livelier. Fish spoiled quickly, and so trade began long before the sun. Merchants shouted their prices, the air heavy with the sharp tang of salt and river water. Buyers pressed forward, bargaining in low voices, eager to secure the freshest catch before supplies vanished. The splashing of water, The scrape of knives and the murmur of haggling created a soundscape very different from the noisy taverns of the night, but no less restless. For bakers, too, the night was their busiest time. Bread was a daily necessity in Rome, distributed not only through markets but also through the state's grain dole. Bakers rose in the middle of the night to knead dough, heat their ovens, and prepare loaves that would be ready by morning. Walking through the city at this hour, one might follow the smell of warm bread drifting from unseen windows, a small comfort amid the shadows. The movement of goods was constant. Olive oil from Spain, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, spices from the East. These supplies did not pause at sunset. Warehouse workers and porters labored through the night, unloading shipments and preparing them for sale. Rome's greatness as an empire was visible not only in its monuments, but also in these quiet hours when goods flowed silently from hand to hand. But commerce at night was not without risk. Darkness provided cover for thieves, and merchants often traveled with guards. Disputes broke out over prices or delayed payments. The vigiles, though tasked mainly with fire, sometimes intervened to settle quarrels or escort traders through dangerous streets. Even in trade, the night carried a sense of unease. And yet there was also opportunity. For the poor of Rome, who lacked steady work, the nighttime economy provided chances to earn coin. Porters carried baskets for wealthier buyers. Children fetched water for merchants. Street sellers offered quick meals, bowls of porridge, bread with cheese, to those laboring before dawn. These small exchanges made the Roman night not only noisy but essential for survival. As we pause here, picture the city at this strange in-between time. The taverns are growing quiet, their last patrons drifting away. The watchmen are still on their rounds, scanning the streets for danger. And at the same time, the markets are stirring, the docks are busy, and ovens are glowing. The eternal city is never still, for even in darkness its economy turns like a wheel, feeding millions of people who depend upon its motion. Section 2. The People of the Night. If the Roman night belonged to anyone, it belonged to the laborers who worked while others slept. These were not the senators in their villas, nor the generals remembered in marble, but the bakers, porters, merchants, and servants who kept the city alive in its most fragile hours. Imagine, for a moment, the bakery. It is the middle of the night, and the ovens are already glowing with heat. A baker, his tunic dusted white with flour, kneads dough with steady, practiced motions. His apprentices carry water, mix ingredients, and shape loaves. The smell of baking bread fills the room, drifting out into the street where a passerby might pause, comforted by the familiar scent. These men will not see the sunlight until their work is nearly done. By dawn, baskets of bread will be ready for sale or distribution, feeding thousands. Step outside, and you hear the rumble of carts along the stone streets. Drivers, weary but determined, guide their mules through the dark. Their voices echo as they call to one another, urging the animals onward. They carry grain from the river docks, amphorae of oil, and crates of imported goods. This movement is permitted only at night, so that by daylight the city's streets are free for citizens to walk. The cost of silence in the day is the noise of commerce in the night. In the fish markets, merchants arrive long before dawn. They speak loudly, announcing their catches, bargaining with buyers by torchlight. The air is sharp with the scent of salt water and scales. Workers pour water over baskets to keep the fish fresh, their hands raw from cold. Servants from wealthy households push through the crowd, seeking the best pieces before supplies vanish. The noise here is constant, a chorus of shouting, bargaining, and splashing. Still, one question remains. If Rome's economy depended so heavily on the labor of its poorest at night, how did the wealthy view this unseen workforce? Did they notice, or did the night markets remain invisible to those who woke only when the bread was already on the table and the fish already prepared? Section 3. The Legacy of Rome's Nocturnal Economy. Consider the baker once more. By the time wealthy citizens awoke, the bread was already on their tables, warm and ready. Few paused to wonder about the men who had labored through the night, their arms aching, their brows damp with sweat. In this way, Rome's poor sustained the comfort of its rich invisibly and without praise. Think, too, of the carts that rumbled through the streets. By morning, the forum's stalls were filled with goods, vegetables stacked in baskets, fish laid out on slabs, amphorae of oil standing in neat rows. The wealthy came to shop, to bargain, and to dine, but the hard work had been done long before in the dark hours of the night. The economy of Rome depended not on daylight transactions, but on the sleepless labor that prepared them. This contrast shaped society itself. The poor, whose nights were filled with toil, became almost invisible in the eyes of the elite. Their fatigue was not recorded in marble inscriptions, their struggles not celebrated in epic poetry. And yet, without them, the city could not have functioned. Rome called itself eternal, but its eternity rested upon the weary shoulders of bakers, porters, and vendors who worked while others slept. The nocturnal economy also created a rhythm that echoed beyond Rome itself. Other cities of the empire followed similar patterns. Ports unloaded ships at night, ovens glowed in the early hours, and markets stirred before dawn. The empire thrived not only on conquest and politics, but on the quiet persistence of ordinary laborers who never saw their names engraved in history. And so we arrive at a gentle reflection. Rome's economy never slept, just as our own world rarely does. In every city today, there are workers who rise in darkness, bakers, drivers, cleaners, porters, sustaining lives that begin only when daylight comes. The rhythm of Rome has not vanished. It lingers in our sleepless modern world, a reminder that while some rest, others labor to keep the cycle unbroken. Story 5. Sacred Darkness. Section 1. The Night and the Gods. When the sun dipped below the horizon in ancient Rome, the city did not simply fall into shadow. For the Romans, the night was not only a time of danger or labor, it was also a time of mystery, when the divine felt closer and the boundary between human life and the world of the gods seemed thinner. Let us picture the sky above Rome. Without the glow of modern lights, the heavens were alive with stars. Constellations stretched wide across the darkness, familiar to every Roman who looked upward. The movement of the stars, the glow of the moon, the sudden flash of a comet, all of these were seen not as chance, but as messages. The night sky was a canvas of meaning, where the gods spoke through light and shadow. Romans were never without their gods, and night brought its own rituals. In homes, small household shrines, the Lararia, stood in corners, decorated with figures of the Lares and Penates, the spirits of family and hearth. As lamps were lit, families offered prayers, a pinch of incense, a drop of wine, a whispered invocation. These acts were not grand ceremonies, but quiet habits, woven into the rhythm of every evening. Beyond the home, the city itself was filled with sacred spaces that came alive at night. Temples rose against the dark, their columns glowing faintly in the light of torches. Priests sometimes kept vigils, watching the stars, waiting for signs. Festivals often stretched into the night, their processions lit by fire, their chants echoing through the streets. To walk through Rome after sunset was not only to hear taverns and carts, it was also to sense the weight of ritual lingering in the air. Certain gods were especially tied to darkness. Luna, the goddess of the moon, guided travelers and guarded those who walked beneath her silver light. Diana, goddess of the hunt, was also a goddess of the night. Her presence felt in forests and quiet places beyond the city walls. And then there was Janus, the two-faced god of thresholds, who presided over beginnings and endings, including the daily passage from day into night. There was also fear. Romans believed that the night was not only sacred, but haunted. Spirits of the dead, the manes, were thought to linger in darkness. Festivals such as the Parentalia and the Lemuria were devoted to honoring or appeasing them, often carried out at night. Families left offerings of food and drink for their ancestors, or performed rituals to drive away restless souls. The silence of midnight was not emptiness, but a reminder that unseen presences might be near. Astrologers and augurs also made the night their study. The movement of stars and planets was believed to reveal the will of the gods. A senator might consult an astrologer under cover of night, seeking knowledge about his fortunes, his household, or even the fate of the empire itself. The flicker of oil lamps beside scrolls of star charts created an atmosphere of secrecy and awe. And yet, not all rituals were solemn. Some were simple comforts. A mother whispered a prayer over her sleeping child. A traveler lit a lamp at a crossroads shrine, asking protection for his journey. A farmer, far from the city, gazed at the moon and trusted that his crops would grow. For every grand temple ceremony, there were countless small acts of faith carried out quietly, night after night. In this way, the Roman night was filled not only with noise and labor, but with sacredness. It was a time when the stars became a temple ceiling, when the household shrine glowed gently with firelight, when families remembered the gods and the dead before allowing themselves to rest. But this raises a question that lingers, like the glow of the moon behind a passing cloud. How did these nightly rituals shape the way Romans understood their place in the world? Did the constant presence of gods in darkness bring comfort, or did it deepen the unease of living in a city that never truly slept? Section 2. Rituals, Festivals, and Superstitions. If the Roman night belonged to the gods, then it also belonged to ritual. The people of Rome did not treat darkness as an empty space between days. They filled it with prayers, offerings, festivals, and fears. To step into the Roman night was to step into a world layered with sacred meaning. Let us begin in the household. As the lamps were lit and meals finished, many families turned toward their shrines. These small lararia, tucked into corners of rooms, carried painted images of the household gods. Offerings were placed, bits of food, drops of wine, a pinch of incense. Children learned to bow their heads as their parents whispered prayers for safety, for health, for peaceful sleep. These rituals were not dramatic, yet they shaped the rhythm of every evening, binding the household to its gods before rest. But beyond the home, night also carried the weight of larger ceremonies. Some festivals spilled into the hours of darkness, filling the city with processions and chants. Torches lit the way as priests and citizens moved through the streets, their songs echoing off the stone walls. For example, during the festival of Floralia, dedicated to Flora, goddess of flowers, celebrations often continued after sunset, with performances, games, and revelry. The flicker of torchlight made the city feel both festive and otherworldly. There were also the somber festivals, where night was a time for communion with the dead. During the Parentalia, families honored their ancestors by bringing offerings to tombs. Bread, wine, and flowers were left at gravesides, sometimes under cover of night, when the air was still and quiet. During the Lemuria, an even older festival, rituals were performed to drive away restless spirits. A father would rise at midnight, walk barefoot through his house, and toss black beans over his shoulder, reciting prayers to banish the dead. The silence of the night was filled with whispered invocations, with fear and reverence interwoven. Superstition clung to these hours. Romans believed that omens were especially potent at night. An owl's cry, the sudden fall of a lamp, or an unexpected dream could all be read as messages from the gods. Dreams themselves were thought to be doorways into divine communication. Some sought interpretations from priests or professional dream readers, convinced that the gods spoke more clearly when the world was wrapped in shadow. Astrology, too, flourished in the night. The stars were not only beautiful, they were signs. Roman generals, emperors, and ordinary citizens alike consulted astrologers to learn their fates. A flickering lamp, a chart of constellations, and the slow movement of planets. These were the tools through which the future was read. The night sky was a vast scroll, written not in ink but in light, and many believed it contained the answers to human uncertainty. Of course, not every ritual brought comfort. Fear was as present as faith. Many Romans believed that witches and practitioners of forbidden magic worked in darkness. Night was when spells were cast, curses whispered, and spirits invoked. The poet Horace once described encountering a band of witches at night, chanting over graves, stirring pots of foul mixtures, and calling upon underworld gods. Whether these stories were exaggerations or not, they reflect the unease Romans felt toward the unseen powers of the dark. And yet, even with fear, there was also reassurance. The rituals provided structure, a way to face the uncertainty of night. Whether through prayer at a household shrine, offerings to ancestors, or chants at a festival, Romans found ways to anchor themselves against the vastness of the dark. The night became not only a time of risk but also of connection, to family, to tradition, and to the gods. If we pause here, we can sense how deeply these rituals shaped Roman life. The city was not merely alive with noise and trade, it was also alive with sacred acts that touched every household. Each lamp that flickered in a window was more than light. It was a small flame linking human life to divine order. But this leaves us with another thought. If rituals and festivals brought meaning to the night, what did Romans see when they looked beyond the city's walls, into the silence of fields, forests, and the vast night sky itself? How did the stars, the moon, and the dark spaces beyond the city deepen their sense of the sacred? Section 3. The Night Sky as a Temple. As we leave the crowded streets and lamplit courtyards of Rome, let us lift our gaze upward. For above the noise of taverns, the cries of merchants, and the tread of the watchmen, there stretched a sky untouched by smoke or flame. The Roman night sky was not empty darkness. It was a temple, vast and enduring, where the gods revealed themselves through light. Imagine standing on the edge of the city, where the buildings give way to open fields. The stars above seem endless, scattered like jewels upon a dark cloth. The moon glows, casting silver light across the land. To a Roman, these sights were never casual. Each constellation, each movement of the heavens, carried meaning. To look upward was to look into the will of the divine. The constellations themselves were stories woven into the night. There was Orion, the great hunter, his form traced by bright stars. There was Venus, the evening star, glowing steadily as a sign of beauty and desire. Jupiter's movement across the heavens was watched closely, for it was tied to the authority of the state. Saturn, slow and distant, carried associations of time and fate. The sky was a living calendar, guiding festivals, rituals, and decisions. For the ordinary Roman, the night sky offered comfort as well as mystery. A farmer in the countryside could measure the seasons by the stars. A sailor relied on constellations to guide his ship across the Mediterranean. Even in the city, a child might fall asleep to the sight of the moon through a small window, imagining the gods who watched from above. The educated, however, looked deeper still. Philosophers and astrologers studied the heavens, seeking patterns. To them, the stars were not only lights but signs, revealing destiny. They believed that the alignment of planets at one's birth shaped a life, and that the movements of the heavens were threads woven into human fate. Even emperors consulted these readings, fearing what the sky might foretell. But the sky was not only about prediction, it was about presence. To look at the stars was to feel that the gods were near, watching silently, their power woven into the very order of the universe. The Roman poet Virgil once wrote of the eternal fires of the sky, suggesting that the heavens themselves were divine, enduring beyond the frailty of human life. And yet, just as the night sky inspired reverence, it also stirred unease. A sudden comet, a blood-red moon, an unexpected eclipse. These were not neutral events. They were omens, often of disaster. People whispered that such signs foretold famine, war, or the death of leaders. Priests were consulted, sacrifices made, prayers whispered in hope of appeasing whatever force had disturbed the harmony of the heavens. Still, the stars endured. Night after night they appeared, steady and familiar. In their rhythm, Romans found reassurance. Even in a city that seemed restless and fragile, the sky remained unbroken, its lights burning long after taverns had emptied and fires had been quenched. Perhaps this is the deepest truth of Roman nights, that while the city below never truly slept, the heavens above offered a constant reminder of something greater. The stars were both a comfort and a mystery, guiding laborers, sailors, priests, and emperors alike. They belonged to everyone, no matter how poor or powerful. And so, when we imagine a Roman lying awake in the insula, or a watchman pausing at a crossroads, or a priest waiting in silence, we must also imagine them lifting their eyes to the sky. There, in the vastness of sacred darkness, they found not silence, but connection, to gods, to fate, and to the enduring order of the universe. But this leaves us with another thought, one we will carry forward. If the night sky connected Romans to the divine, what about the world of entertainment and feasting? What happened when the sun set, and theaters, gladiators, and banquets continued long into the hours of darkness? Section 3. The Night Sky as a Temple. As we leave the crowded streets and lamplit courtyards of Rome, let us lift our gaze upward. For above the noise of taverns, the cries of merchants, and the tread of the watchmen, there stretched a sky untouched by smoke or flame. The Roman night sky was not empty darkness. It was a temple, vast and enduring, where the gods revealed themselves through light. Imagine standing on the edge of the city, where the buildings give way to open fields. The stars above seem endless, scattered like jewels upon a dark cloth. The moon glows, casting silver light across the land. To a Roman, these sights were never casual. Each constellation, each movement of the heavens, carried meaning. To look upward was to look into the will of the divine. The constellations themselves were stories woven into the night. There was Orion, the great hunter, his form traced by bright stars. There was Venus, the evening star, glowing steadily as a sign of beauty and desire. Jupiter's movement across the heavens was watched closely, for it was tied to the authority of the state. Saturn, slow and distant, carried associations of time and fate. The sky was a living calendar, guiding festivals, rituals, and decisions. For the ordinary Roman, the night sky offered comfort as well as mystery. A farmer in the countryside could measure the seasons by the stars. A sailor relied on constellations to guide his ship across the Mediterranean. Even in the city, a child might fall asleep to the sight of the moon through a small window, imagining the gods who watched from above. The educated, however, looked deeper still. Philosophers and astrologers studied the heavens, seeking patterns. To them, the stars were not only lights but signs, revealing destiny. They believed that the alignment of planets at one's birth shaped a life, and that the movements of the heavens were threads woven into human fate. Even emperors consulted these readings, fearing what the sky might foretell. But the sky was not only about prediction, it was about presence. To look at the stars was to feel that the gods were near, watching silently, their power woven into the very order of the universe. The Roman poet Virgil once wrote of the eternal fires of the sky, suggesting that the heavens themselves were divine, enduring beyond the frailty of human life. And yet, just as the night sky inspired reverence, it also stirred unease. A sudden comet, a blood-red moon, an unexpected eclipse. These were not neutral events. They were omens, often of disaster. People whispered that such signs foretold famine, war, or the death of leaders. Priests were consulted, sacrifices made, prayers whispered in hope of appeasing whatever force had disturbed the harmony of the heavens. Still, the stars endured. Night after night they appeared, steady and familiar. In their rhythm, Romans found reassurance. Even in a city that seemed restless and fragile, the sky remained unbroken, its lights burning long after taverns had emptied and fires had been quenched. Perhaps this is the deepest truth of Roman nights, that while the city below never truly slept, the heavens above offered a constant reminder of something greater. The stars were both a comfort and a mystery, guiding laborers, sailors, priests, and emperors alike. They belonged to everyone, no matter how poor or powerful. And so, when we imagine a Roman lying awake in the insula, or a watchman pausing at a crossroads, or a priest waiting in silence, we must also imagine them lifting their eyes to the sky. There, in the vastness of sacred darkness, they found not silence, but connection, to gods, to fate, and to the enduring order of the universe. But this leaves us with another thought, one we will carry forward. If the night sky connected Romans to the divine, what about the world of entertainment and feasting? What happened when the sun set, and theaters, gladiators, and banquets continued long into the hours of darkness? Imagine, for a moment, that you drift into sleep, and when your eyes open again, you find yourself lying on cool stone, beneath the clear blue sky of Attica. You are in the heart of Athens, around the 5th century BCE, at the very center of its public life, the agora. The agora was not simply a market. It was the pulse of the city. Every step across its dusty ground, every voice that echoed across its colonnades carried traces of political debates, commercial exchanges, and sacred rituals. To fall asleep in the agora meant waking into the full hum of Athens, where nothing was ever still, yet everything moved at its own deliberate pace. You sit up slowly, brushing fine grains of sand from your clothes. The sun is gentle now, casting long shadows of marble columns and the occasional olive tree that had grown between stone walkways. Around you, life begins early. Traders arrive before the first golden rays strike the Acropolis in the distance. Men carry baskets of figs, their skins slightly wrinkled but bursting with sweetness. Others bring amphorae of oil, sealed with clay stoppers, still smelling faintly of pressed olives from the groves outside the city walls. It is not noisy in the way modern markets are. The sounds are steady, measured, almost ritualistic. The creak of cartwheels on uneven ground, the rhythmic shouts of men calling their wares, the soft murmur of women haggling for flour or honey. If you listen carefully, you can even hear the faint scraping of styluses on wax tablets as scribes record transactions, debts, and agreements. In Athens, the agora was more than a space of trade. It was a gathering of minds. Philosophers wandered here, sometimes followed by curious groups of students. Socrates himself could often be found, not in the grand halls of temples, but among the clutter of the market, asking simple but piercing questions about justice, virtue, and the soul. You could pass a fishmonger one moment, and the next, overhear a heated discussion on the nature of truth. But if you arrived here expecting grandeur, you might be disappointed. The agora was dusty. It smelled of fish left too long in the sun, of sweat carried on wool garments, of animals tied impatiently near stalls. The stones were cracked in places, uneven to the touch, worn by countless sandals and bare feet. And yet it was this mixture of the ordinary and extraordinary that made it the living center of Athens. You wander slowly, letting your eyes fall on the objects of trade. Bronze tools lie neatly arranged, hammers, chisels, and knives, their dull gleam suggesting long use. A potter displays rows of clay vessels, each carefully shaped but not finely painted. These were not treasures, but everyday necessities. Storage jars, drinking cups, and oil lamps, ready to be taken into modest homes. The potter's hands are rough and caked with clay, his voice hoarse as he bargains. He does not look for beauty, but for survival, knowing that a cracked vessel might mean wasted grain or spoiled oil. Nearby, an elderly woman arranges woven baskets, their reeds still smelling faintly of the riverbanks where they were cut. She mutters to herself, rearranging them again and again, as if the order matters as much as the sale. A young boy tugs at her himation, restless, already dreaming of games in the dusty square. The agora was also where laws and decisions of the city found their beginning. Sturdy stone structures lined its edges, some adorned with columns, others plain. In the Stoa of Zeus, magistrates gathered hearing disputes about property or trade. Citizens, always men, always free-born, might crowd together, waiting their turn to complain, argue, or witness. For them, these dusty stones were as powerful as any throne. Here, decisions could be made that would ripple through the city, affecting harvests, alliances, or even war. As you walk further, your eyes fall on a row of small altars, each dedicated to different gods. Some are plain, blackened by ash and smoke. Others bear faint carvings, worn smooth by years of touch. Sacrifices were made here not in grand ceremonies, but in the steady rhythm of daily devotion. A slice of meat, a splash of wine, a few grains of barley, small gestures offered to the divine, reminding Athenians that their lives were always under watchful eyes. The agora was a place of contradictions. It was sacred and profane, orderly and chaotic, bustling and yet, in its repetition, strangely monotonous. If you had to spend your days here, the hours would blur together. The same merchants would call out the same prices. The same disputes would rise over debts or weights. The same priests would sprinkle barley before small flames. And yet, hidden within this ordinary rhythm were the threads of history itself. Here, young men trained their voices in debate, preparing for the assembly where the fate of Athens could be decided. Here, artisans quietly passed down skills that would shape the city's economy. Here, gossip spread faster than official proclamations, weaving together the private and public life of every citizen. As you pause, the air grows warmer. Shadows shorten. The hum of voices grows thicker as more citizens flood the square. Perhaps you wonder, what would it feel like to live your whole life here, in the slow repetition of this marketplace? Would the agora still feel alive after years, or would it become nothing more than dust, noise, and endless bargaining? And if this marketplace, so full of detail yet so easily forgotten, was the center of one of history's greatest cities, what does that tell us about the true nature of greatness? Section 2. The people of the agora. Faces in the crowd. When the sun climbs higher and the air begins to shimmer faintly with heat, the agora fills to its fullest. It is no longer just a place of sellers and buyers. It becomes a living web of conversations, deals, arguments, and idle observations. If you stay long enough, you will notice that each corner of this place has its own rhythm, its own kind of people, and its own kind of purpose. You might first notice the citizens, the men of Athens, wrapped in simple woolen himatians, their feet dusty from the stone paths. They are not kings, not soldiers, but ordinary men who carry the weight of citizenship as both privilege and duty. Some stroll with an easy gait, stopping to examine jars of wine or to greet acquaintances with clasped hands. Others stand in tight groups, heads close together, whispering about a new law being proposed or the speech of a rival at the assembly. Citizenship in Athens was no casual matter. To stand here in the agora and call yourself an Athenian was to be tied deeply to the city's fate. It meant attending the assembly when summoned, voting on decrees, serving in juries, and sometimes going to war. Even the most ordinary man carried with him the quiet weight of politics because in Athens the city was not separate from the man. The city was the man, and the man was the city. Yet not all who walked the agora had this status. You would also see medics, resident foreigners, men and women who lived and worked in Athens but could not claim its citizenship. They might be traders from islands across the Aegean, bringing strange perfumes, bright fabrics, or metals from distant lands. They were tolerated, even needed, for they enriched the city with trade. But they stood slightly apart, their voices marked by different accents, their legal rights sharply limited. Then, of course, there were slaves. Their presence is easy to overlook at first, for they blended into the life of the agora. Some carried heavy baskets of fruit on their shoulders, sweat rolling down their arms. Others followed their masters, standing silently while discussions unfolded. A few worked as assistants to craftsmen, their hands skilled but their status invisible. Slaves were not rare in Athens. They were everywhere, woven into the daily rhythm of labor. And in the agora they were reminders that the freedom of some was built upon the servitude of others. Women, by contrast, were less visible. Athenian women, especially those of citizen families, were not encouraged to mingle freely in the agora. Their world was often the home, where weaving, managing stores, and raising children took place. Yet even so you would see them occasionally, especially poor women, who might sell herbs, bread, or woven cloth. They were careful in their movements, cautious under the eyes of men, yet necessary to the life of the marketplace. Without their work, the agora would not function. If you sit quietly at the edge of the square, you will notice another type of figure drifting through the crowd: the thinkers. Some wear simple cloaks, their hair and beards untidy, their sandals worn thin. They carry no wares, no baskets, no tools. Instead, they carry questions. You might recognize one, Socrates himself, stopping a young man to ask what courage is, or whether justice can ever truly be known. His words are not shouted. They are asked, softly, insistently, until the listener grows restless or curious. Around such men, the agora becomes less a market of goods and more a market of ideas. Nearby, the sophists display their craft, teaching the art of speaking, of argument, of persuasion. Their lessons are not free. A young man, eager for public life, may hand over coins for a promise that he will learn how to sway the assembly with polished words, even if truth itself remains uncertain. Some Athenians sneer at them, calling them corrupters of youth. Others see them as essential, for in a city ruled by speech and debate, words were as valuable as silver. In one corner, scribes and notaries sit with wax tablets and styluses, their heads bent low. They record debts, witness agreements, and write letters for those who cannot. Their work is unglamorous, but it holds power. A single mark pressed into wax could mean the transfer of land, the repayment of a loan, or the beginning of a lawsuit. In the agora, nothing escaped record for long. And then there are the soldiers. Not the hoplites in formation, but ordinary men who have served or will serve when the city calls. They stand casually, leaning on spears or resting shields at their feet, speaking of training drills or distant campaigns. Their presence is a quiet reminder that Athens was never free from the shadow of war. Even here, amid olives and pottery, the thought of Sparta or Persia lingered like a faint shadow over every deal struck. As the morning deepens, the voices of the agora swell. Disputes break out over prices, accusations fly about false weights or impure goods, and magistrates must step in to calm tempers. Children dart through the crowds, laughing, weaving between legs, their laughter mixing with the sharper tones of arguments. Dogs bark, chasing after scraps thrown from butchers' stalls. The air is filled with dust, heat, and the low hum of hundreds of lives weaving together. If you remain still, you can almost map the agora through its sounds alone. The steady chant of sellers near the food stalls, the rhythmic ring of a blacksmith's hammer striking iron, the quieter murmur of philosophers, their words half lost in the noise, the scraping of sandals on stone, the bray of donkeys, the rustle of olive leaves stirred by faint winds. This, then, was Athens. Not its temples alone, not its theaters, not even its famed Acropolis, but this daily mixture of sweat, words, and trade. The agora was where men and women carried their burdens, shared their thoughts, and stitched together the fabric of the city one small act at a time. But if all this daily life pulsed here, you might ask yourself, how did Athenians keep order among so many voices, so many disputes, so many ambitions? What kept this crowded square from sinking into chaos, and how did its rules shape the city that grew from it?